They say campuses are where lives begin, friendships formed in dorm lounges, futures sketched in lecture halls, the echo of a bell that marks a new semester. But there are other campuses where a different kind of attendance never ended, where the bell tolls and no one answers, where desks collect dust and something else still sits in them. This is 15 haunted schools in America where students never returned. Imagine a corridor light that never fully turns on. Imagine an empty classroom where a small hand still taps the desk in time with a long dead lesson. These places hold memories that don't fade, not because they are famous or elegant or even particularly old, because something inside them has refused to move on. In some cases, students literally died on campus. In others, people left traumatized and never came back. In every instance, the local lore insists the past clings to the mortar and timber, replaying like a film no one can eject. This countdown is not a courtroom. It will not pronounce guilt or innocence. It will present history, local reports, and the moments that keep investigators returning with recorders and cameras. Where names are uncertain in the records we've been given, the original transcriptions are preserved and noted as indefinido. Stories are reported as accounts say, witnesses claim, or local lore holds. The title's promise, students never returned, is a narrative frame. Some never returned alive. Some left and were never the same. And some, the stories insist, never ceased to attend at all. 1. Pennhurst State School, where the tunnels keep their secrets. Pennhurst State School and Hospital sits in southeastern Pennsylvania, a hulking campus of stone and mortar that once promised care and education. Opened in the early 20th century as an institution for people the state labeled in need of special treatment, Pennhurst would grow into a complex of wards, classrooms, and a network of corridors that run like veins through the property. Over decades, the facility swelled with children and adults whose names are now only entries in brittle ledgers. Allegations of neglect and mistreatment would later fill courtrooms and newspaper pages, but long before the legal verdicts, rumors began. Footprints that stop at cell doors, cries that echo from empty wings, the unmistakable sense of being watched. The campus has a handful of signature spots: the central administration building with its high-ceilinged corridors, the courtyard where benches sag under the weight of moss, and the subterranean tunnels that once ferried staff between wards in all weathers. Those tunnels are, according to frequent accounts, where the air grows cold enough to see breath, where the lights stutter into dead white, and where footsteps echo as if dozens of children march in the dark. Witnesses tell a consistent scene: a team of urban explorers wedged into the tunnel, breath steaming in their flashlight cones, when the noise begins. Soft at first, like a shoe hitting damp concrete, then building into a staccato march. We all heard them, one account says, like little feet. Then, when they swing their beams to the far curve, nothing at all. On more than one occasion, visitors report the sound of a small voice calling a name, too faint to make out, followed by a lump of something, a small ball or a faded doll, rolling toward them from the darkness. A recorded EVP played back low on headphones captures a breathy syllable that could be a child's name. Investigators label it as such but stop short of certitude. Those who have set up cameras in the tunnels report equipment that dies suddenly, batteries drained in minutes, SD cards that refuse to format, lights that blink off when recorded. One investigator, speaking carefully, said his thermal imager drew a constancy in one corridor, temperatures dipping to single digits in pockets, then snapping back as if something moved from one patch of air to another. For those who once lived and worked at Pennhurst, there is a final, aching image. Small shoes lined up where they should not belong, forever waiting to be called to class. The walls keep repeating the same lesson. The next campus holds a different kind of silence. If you love haunted histories, hit like and subscribe. We've got 14 more. 2. Waverly Hills Schoolrooms, name transcribed as Waverly Hills Schoolrooms. Correct modern name indefinido. The child at the window. Most visitors know Waverly Hills as a sanatorium perched on a ridge in Kentucky, where tuberculosis once claimed thousands and a single stairwell became infamous. Less often told is the schoolroom story that threads through local retellings, that amid wards and convalescent wings, makeshift classrooms were set up. small, ephemeral sanctuaries where teachers tried to keep childhood ordinary against a background of coughing and loss. The rooms themselves are described as bright in memory. Low chairs, a blackboard, sunlight angling through paned windows. Those are the details people recall before the creep arrives. A tiny hand tugging at the sleeve of a visitor, a chalkboard line traced by an invisible finger, toys appearing in the center of a circle, as if an unseen teacher had set them down for a lesson. The most persistent figure is a little girl named Mary in the local lore, a name that surfaces again and again. She is said to play with a ball. She is often seen near the window, silhouetted against the sky. Witnesses say she will look at you, then look away, as if she were shy of the present. One particularly chilling account came from a small group on a guided after-hours tour. They stood in the schoolroom, phones out but gathering no signal, when one of them felt a small hand pat the back of her neck. She spun and no one was there. A whisper brushed her ear, reported by the group afterward as a breathy, barely formed play. Later, on playback of a recorder, a soft syllable that could be Mary emerges for a second, layered beneath the ambient hum of the heating. Investigators who have recorded there warn that equipment often fails to capture full clarity. Still, patterns recur. Tiny footsteps in corridors meant only for walkers, sudden cold at child height, the smell of soap and apples, ordinary scents anchored to impossible presences. Whether these are the lingering impressions of children who died in quarantine, or the psychic echo of trauma compressed into rooms that were meant to shelter innocence, the image endures. Small balls skipping across an empty floor, and a shadow at the sash who watches the world of the living go by. The next campus's library holds a different kind of watchful hush. 3. Notre Dame, name transcribed as Notre Dame. Correct modern name indefinido. The Lacelike footprints by the lake. On the map, the place appears as a grand Catholic institution with a campus that borders water. Local retellings, transcribed here with the original spelling as Notre Dame, describe a place where architecture meets myth. Gargoyled facades, a basilica whose bell tolls at precise hour, and a campus lake whose glassy surface reflects more than sky. The haunting centers on a handful of points: Washington Hall, a performance and gathering space, a shadow-haunted lakeside path, and a chapel where the organ sometimes plays without hands on the keys. A recurring figure in the lore is George Gibb, transcribed that way in the accounts we were given. Witnesses claim George is a specter of a young athlete, forever bound to the gridiron and its tragedies. The transcribed name evokes a famous ball player from the early 20th century, but this script does not assert identity. It reports the name as recorded. Students and night staff describe late practices where a set of footprints appears on the muddy shore, laced like cleats, and then disappears at the waterline. A late-night janitor once told investigators he found muddy, lace-like footprints leading up to the edge of the small amphitheater by the lake. He followed them with a flashlight, expecting to find a prankster. The beam hit the shoreline, then caught movement in the trees. A flash of white, like a uniform slipping away into shadow. On his recording, there is a low, rhythmic thud, not wind, not animal. Something like the distant echo of a crowd. Later, a student on a solo walk reported stepping out of the dark and finding a sweatshirt he did not own draped on a bench, wet to the touch with no footprints leading to or away from it. When he picked it up, he said, a chill pricked his scalp, as though a presence pressed past him and walked on water. Investigators note that cameras trained on the chapel sometimes produce footage with unexplained lens flares or a faint figure at the pulpit, only when played back at half speed. An EVP captured near the lake, so faint that some listeners dismiss it, contains a breathy utterance, and one clearer capture yields a single two-syllable sound that listeners variously interpret as a name or a piece of a chant. Students, at least in shared accounts, treat the story with the half-amused dread familiar to campus legend. You don't sit alone on the lakeshore after midnight. The next place on our list offers a quieter terror, the slow creak of history in a colonial setting. 4. Hampton-Sydney, name transcribed as Hampton-Sydney, correct modern name indefinido, the rector who still walks the quad. The building stones are old enough that the mortar remembers hands. That is the impression of those who tell the story of Hampton-Sydney, a transcription that may point toward a long-established college in Virginia. Regardless of the exact modern name, the campus lore recorded here centers on tradition and the idea that formalities never really end on some campuses. A rector or faculty figure, stern and immaculate, is the most commonly reported apparition, a shadowed man in a frock, hat tucked low, drifting across the quad at dawn. Historically, such institutions grew in an era that prized strict discipline and order. The stories preserved in local memory speak of students disciplined harshly for infractions, of stern lectures and older buildings that could not disguise their age. These elements, together with a few tragedies, falls from towers, and an old bell tower that once cracked during a storm, seeded a tradition of superstition. It is within the library and the bell tower that the sightings most often happen. Lamps guttering with no cause, pages turned though no breeze enters, a feeling of etiquette that borders on oppression. A graduate returning for a reunion claimed she was locked out of a banquet hall late one autumn night. As she paced beneath the arched walkway, careful in her evening dress, she felt the pressure of a hand hovering near her elbow, as if some invisible guide insisted she keep time with an invisible march. When the doors finally opened, she described the dining room as perfectly set, plates shining as if expecting a headmaster, but empty. On the audio she later submitted to investigators, a clipped, formal voice, clearer than other EVPs, says what listeners take to be, "Take your seat." Skeptics suggest prank recordings. Believers say it carries an accent that fits a different century. Equipment left overnight in the bell tower often exhibits anomalies. Motion sensors trigger with no recorded movement. Photographic negatives show slight distortion at the edges where the bell's shadow should not be. For students raised on rituals and diplomas, the idea that a faculty figure would simply continue to patrol the campus in death is the kind of story that feels less like a supernatural creep and more like a punctuation mark on old authority. Some lessons do not end with graduation. The next institution moves from meticulously kept rituals to the messy aftermath of institutional breakdown. 5. Pennhurst Annexes and the Chapel of Saurin Hall, Father Saurin named in local lore, Confession and Footsteps. Some of the transcription's place names come with clerical echoes: Saurin Hall, Father Saurin, and the chapel where parishioners once flocked. Here, as elsewhere, the presence most frequently reported is a priestly or clerical figure, soft-voiced, robed in silhouette, who appears in chapels and basilicas, often at the stroke of predictable hours, vespers, matins, and the late hour when the campus should be dark. Saurin Hall, in the accounts we have, is described as a seminary building with a chapel tucked inside. The chapel is small and spare, a wooden altar darkened with age, a single stained-glass window that casts a red wash across the floor in late afternoon, and narrow pews that creak when no one sits. Visitors have reported kneelers that lower themselves, footsteps that run along the aisle, and the scent of old incense that arrives without a source. One student studying in a back pew wrote in a forum years ago about falling asleep over a book, only to be woken by the sensation of someone standing at the altar. He opened his eyes and saw a figure in an old cassock, hands clasped, head inclined. The student later said he felt a warmth, like the pressure of a hand passing over his hair. The photograph he took on his phone shows a smear of light where the figure stood, and when enlarged, a vertical face-like blur. Investigators who examined the photo point to lens aberration. Others point to the way a mind will shape a little light into a face when the context invites it. Not all reports are gentle. One visiting researcher claimed he left the confessional room and felt his collar tugged, as if someone had brushed past to take his place. Another account relates a woman who sat alone lighting a candle when a choir tone, low and organ-like, issued from the direction of the loft. Her voice recorder later contained a clean, male-sounding phrase the listeners could not agree on, though many heard the word forgive. For communities rooted in ritual, the appearance of priestly figures in the dim chapel performs a continuity that is equal parts comfort and unease. Is the comfort of an inherited prayer keeping something there? Or are old sins, unresolved, the reason the footsteps never quite leave? 6. Stevens College, name transcribed as Stevens College. Correct modern name indefinido. Dormitory doors that breathe. Women's colleges and all-female dormitories carry a particular brand of rumor. Pranks that never end, love affairs that haunt, and importantly, the way rooms hold the weight of years. The place the transcript labels Stevens College is the locus of stories about dormitory doors that close in the night and bedsheets that flutter through the windows are latched. The main haunt is a long corridor known simply as the West Wing, where the wallpaper peels in ribbons and the old fire escape rattles against the eaves like a metronome. Historically, such schools offered a cloistered environment where every rumor blossomed into legend. In these corridors are reports of shadowy students in old-fashioned clothing, wandering with their arms full of textbooks no one else can identify. The nocturnal phenomena focus on sensory details intended to unbalance the living. A scent of cold perfume along a passageway, laughter heard from rooms with locked doors, the distinct impression of being watched while you sleep. A maintenance worker recounted a night he spent replacing broken light fixtures in the West Wing. He swore that as he climbed the ladder, the floorboards below him creaked in a pattern like pacing, left, right, left, and he looked down to see no feet. A resident he later interviewed reported waking to find her bedroom door slightly ajar and a single hairpin on the floor by her pillow, a small domestic object that had not belonged to anyone in her suite. When a group of paranormal investigators placed contact microphones and motion detectors in the suite, the contact mic picked up a whisper too soft to decipher, and the motion sensor flashed as if something small had passed by the bed. For some, the evidence is suggestive but incomplete. For others, the dormitory keeps its ancient students in a kind of habitual attendance. These 6 schools are only a fraction of the full list, but patterns have begun to emerge. Tunnels and stairwells, chapels and dorms, lakesides and bell towers. The types of presences shift. Actors of authority, children frozen in play, lone athletes pacing by the water. But the sensations repeat. Breath that fogs the air, fingertips cold on your forearm, the unmistakable impression that someone is occupying the seat beside you even when the chair is empty. The next entries deepen one thread in particular, the way institutional failure and tragedy leave an imprint on place, and how that imprint is read by the living as attendance. 7. Montevallo, Monteallo, Montlair, names transcribed as Montevallo, Monteallo, Montlair. Correct modern name indefinido. The tower with the slow bell. The transcriptions give us 3 variations on a name. The place itself is described with precision that survives the spelling. A campus strewn across rolling hills, centered by a stone tower that houses a bell older than many of its students. The tower is the place most people mention first, and then they move on to the dormitories that cluster around it. Historically, towers have a grammar all their own. They are markers for time, calling students to class, marking the hour of prayers, recording the seasons in a series of tolls. The tower here seems to toll out of time. Witnesses report that the bell rings on nights when there is no maintenance scheduled, or it tolls fewer times than the hour demands, or it gives a single long, low note that leaves the hairs at the nape of the neck standing erect. One evening, a late-night study group in the library witnessed the tower's shadow slide across the quad in a manner they described as wrong, too fast, like a sundial thrown into hurry. Students began to make jokes, then grew quiet when they heard the bell, a sound that seemed to come from underground rather than from the tower. A student studying alone in a stairwell heard the bell, felt it translate into the fabric of the building, and saw a pair of footsteps, wet as if from rain, climb the stairs and vanish into the landing ahead. The photograph he took in that landing shows a smudge. The grain of dust moves in an arc not consistent with the rest of the image. Investigators point out that humidity, film, and time can cause similar artifacts. Still, the students' accounts of irregular bell tolls feed the narrative that the campus keeps a different kind of calendar. Where the bell rings, people say, old schedules keep playing. In the dorms around the tower, residents have reported waking at exactly 2:13 a.m., the hour when a former student is said to have left campus and never returned. The hours and the bell join as an insistence. Some classes are permanent. The next campus we will visit holds sorrow in its basements. 8. The abandoned laboratory classrooms at an indefinido technical school. The smell that doesn't leave not every haunted campus is cloistered in ivy. Some are pragmatic clusters of brick and steel where experiments and failures once occurred under the hum of fluorescent light. The transcripts refer to a technical school with an abandoned set of lab classrooms. Their story is about neglect. The overhead lights that hum, the faint chemical tang that lingers in the vents, and the smell that many returning alumni describe as impossible to dismiss, like burned rubber and ozone threaded through old paper. Historically, technical programs often suffered budget cuts and relocations, leaving behind suites of outdated equipment and sometimes accidents forever folded into the archive. It is in these labs that people have reported cold corners, the sudden sensation of itching or a metallic taste, and the sensation that someone is bent over a bench adjusting equipment that is not in fact active. A group of students exploring the empty labs for a film project wrote that as they walked down the hallway, the smell grew stronger, and then, suddenly, a beaker they had propped on a bench rolled steadily toward them without visible contact. On playback of a camera, the beaker's motion looks gradual and smooth, as if a slow breath of air pushed it. The motion sensor registered no gust, and the group found no explanation. That same camera later flickered, and a figure in a lab coat appears as a quick smear in one frame, gone in the next. Investigators caution that drafts, settlements, and temperature gradients can move small objects. Yet the cumulative effect, the smell, the cold, the inexplicable motion, leaves witnesses convinced the building rehearses a past of work and mishap, forever interrupted. 9. The campus infirmary at a former sanatorium turned school, indefinito. The pulse that is not yours. Some campuses repurposed older buildings. Where once patients convalesced, students now sleep and argue and love. Where nurses once tended the sick, resident advisors now do rounds. The transcript points to one such transformation, an infirmary on a modern campus that used to be part of a sanatorium complex. The place keeps its hospital geometry, long hallways, numbered rooms, a central nurse's station, and many of the reports revolve around the same motif, the echo of treatment. Visitors to the infirmary report an odd sensation of pressure, like a hand pressing gently on the chest during the middle of the night. A resident assistant described waking to find the lights dimmed to a blue wash, monitors beeping softly though they were unplugged, and the sensation of an unseen presence at her bedside. The recorded audio from that night features a low, rhythmic sound that investigators call a throb. Not quite a heartbeat, but suggestive enough to unsettle listeners. On the other side of the ledger, the place has been the site of recorded EVPs that sound like someone repeating numbers. Room numbers, perhaps, or whispering instructions that could be mistaken for clinical shorthand. Visitors tend to interpret these as echoes of the old routines, calls for medicine, someone checking vitals, a nurse calling out a patient's name in a tone that could be duty or devotion. The confluence of medical architecture and youthful occupancy produces a tension that is uniquely eerie. The campus rehearses caretaking long after the sick are gone. At the midpoint of our tally, the evidence is rarely conclusive. It is cumulative. One gentle brush in a chapel, one ball rolling from an unseen hand, a bell that tolls on no schedule. Each of these moments leaves witnesses with the same uneasy aftertaste. Places remember. Ahead lie universities with libraries that close on ghostly hours, and playgrounds that remember children who once laughed there. The next entries will turn toward academic spaces where study and scholarship accumulate their own residual presence. 10. The old library on a northeastern college campus, indefinito, whispers between the stacks. Libraries are repositories of memory by design. They store words, dates, decisions, and the faint grease of hundreds of fingers turning pages. The old library that appears in our transcripts, its name indistinct, has long been a locus of protection for the town's scholarly memory. Students who study there late describe a hush that is not merely quiet but expectant, a pressure that suggests the past is listening as intently as you are. Reporters of strange phenomena mention whispering voices, low and undecipherable, that seem to move between stacks. Other accounts note books that tilt as if someone has just used them and then set them back, or the precise placement of a page marker in a volume no one reports having opened. One senior remembers waking to find her textbook open to a chapter she had been trying to decode for weeks. The margin notes included handwriting she did not recognize, slanted and old-fashioned. Investigators who placed parabolic microphones among the stacks recorded nothing discernible at first. When they played the files back, a soft, wordless rustle emerges, like clothing in a narrow aisle. On the security footage, a figure appears in the periphery, less than a second long, but when the investigators froze the frame, the figure's head lacked definition, almost a smear of shadow between two beams of lamplight. Libraries are meant to be visited at night. Many universities keep late study hours. Here, the night itself feels populated. 11. The chapel steps at a Midwestern State University, indefinido, a voice that calls from the stone. Chapel steps have always been places of pause. Students lingering between classes, lovers meeting under columns, or solitary figures turning a prayer into a habit. The stone steps of this Midwestern university carry a specific story. Late-night passers-by hear a single voice call their name from the depth of the stones. The recorded accounts emphasize the personal horror of having a name called when you are alone, an intimacy intrusive enough to make people run. Historical notes suggest the steps are older than much of the rest of the campus, reused from an earlier structure, and that several deaths occurred nearby over the decades. Accidents on those very stones, separations that ended badly. Whether these deaths directly caused the calling is a matter of interpretation. Witnesses insist the call is precise, sometimes articulated by a tone that is almost parental, almost home. One account tells of a student who answered after hearing his name and found only a pile of dried leaves on the steps and a single damp imprint of a shoe the size of a child's. On playback of a sonic recorder hidden in the shrubbery, a faint utterance that could be his nickname is present, quiet as a cigarette ember. The combination of intimacy and emptiness is the thing that listeners remember. The steps are an invitation no one wants to accept. 12. A coastal college's observatory and lecture hall, indefinido, a chalk line that rewrites itself. Campuses with observatories have the unique magic of looking out to the sky, of calculating distances no human can cross. At one coastal college included in our notes, an observatory sits above a lecture hall where the chalkboard sometimes shows diagrams no one recalls drawing, orbital arcs, names of stars long retired by catalogs, or a single chalked circle that appears to pulse faintly under camera light. Students report that the lecture hall can feel colder than the rest of the building, as though the knowledge stored there seeks less the warmth of the human body and more the thin, absolute cold of outer space. One visiting professor claimed to have found a chalked message on the board that read, according to his memory, "I didn't leave." He took a photograph. When investigators enlarged the image, they found the chalk smudged in a pattern similar to the smear of a small hand dragging across wet stone. EVPs taken in the observatory sometimes pick up an audible counting, 1, 2, 3, much too regular to be natural. Instruments thought to be calibrated properly sometimes show transient errors in the moments these EVPs occur. Scientists who have been students and later investigators caution that such calibrations can drift, that humidity affects readings. But to those who sit late under the dome and feel the press of absence, the instruments are less important than the feeling that someone once counted nights over and over until they stopped arriving. 13. The memorial auditorium of an old normal school, teacher training college, indefinido, lessons that repeat. Normal schools trained teachers who would populate the classrooms of small towns. Their museums of pedagogy often occupy auditorium spaces where stage curtains are heavy and the smell of old varnish clings. This particular auditorium, transcribed from the source, has a legend about a recurring rehearsal. The stage lights will come on for a single minute at 2:02 a.m., and the rustle of many costumes will sound, though no one is backstage. Accounts say the auditorium was the site of a tragedy, a collapse during a cramped performance decades ago, or perhaps a gathering that turned wrong. Witnesses who have spent nights in the auditorium report waking to the sense of 100 tiny seats occupied, to the rustle of pages as if books were turning, and to a single distant voice practicing lines that do not exist in any contemporary script. One film student set up a long exposure shot across the stage, and found in the photograph a bleached streak of light that fans out like the wings of a bird. He says it moved just once across the floor while he watched. Investigators can attribute such streaks to exposure settings, passing cars, or insects near the lens. Nonetheless, in a building that feels like a theater of memory, such traces are read as cues. The show is still running somewhere behind the curtains. 14. The closed circular dorm at an academy for young men, indefinido, footsteps that circle military and quasi-military academies produce an atmosphere of discipline that can survive long after the students have left. One such academy's circular dorm, included in the original transcriptions, is described as a ring of rooms around a central common. The phenomenon reported there is the sound of disciplined footsteps, shoes hitting the floor in perfect concurrence, marching around and around, though roll call is long over. Alumni say the circular pattern is the cruelest kind of memory, a perfect rehearsal. Visitors who stay the night in the central common hear the march start at 1 a.m., build in confidence, then stop at 1:06 as if given an order to halt. Those who peek into the rows of rooms claim to see a shadow move like a parade, a suggestion of shoulders squared and trousers creased. On one recorded night, a microphone placed in the common recorded footfalls at 1:03, 1:04, and 1:05. Each step graduated in volume as if a squad were marching at varying distances. Motion sensors in rooms around the ring did not trigger. The effect is orderly to the point of cruelty. The living are reminded of the control once exerted over bodies that are now only memories. 15. The elementary school playground behind an old mission, indefinido. Laughter on the wind. Our list closes for now, with a place everyone understands. A playground. Swings, a metal slide, the rub of crusted sand in between slats. This playground, tucked behind an aging mission school, is said to be haunted not by authority or institution, but by the brittle elastic echo of childhood itself. Laughter snaps through the air on a cold day when no one is present. Small handprints appear on painted rails and fade by morning. Local lore in this case is careful and sorrowful. Records show that the mission served children who were far from home, children who carried the weather of other lives. Accounts say some did not go home. Witnesses who walk the playground alone at dusk report a sensation like two small hands grabbing their ankles and a pair of small, cold footsteps running past. Photographs taken of the empty swings sometimes show a faint blur in motion, the arc of a child who did not leave. Investigators report EVPs with clear childlike intonations. One capture, repeated among a half-dozen recordings, yields a single bright voice saying, "Again." When asked, longtime community members temper the creepiness with sadness. The playground remembers the days between classes and the unforgiving schedule that made childhood into routine and routine into grief. The place does not jeer, it replays. We stop here for a moment because these first 15 entries, these stories, these hauntings, are the sum of a pattern and the start of a question. Each campus holds a reminder that building bones remember what people have done within them. Care and cruelty, lessons and laughter, punishments and prayers. The evidence is rarely decisive, but it accumulates in a way that changes how people walk through these spaces. Some go cautiously. Some never return. Some come back again and again with recorders, hoping to catch a syllable or a flash. Some leave convinced that a class has let out for everyone but them. Beyond the instruments and EVPs, beyond the photographs and the rumor mill, there is a persistent human reaction to these places. They make the living feel like guests in someone else's attendance. They fold history into the present in weird ways. Bell chimes that sound like someone's last hour. Toys found on empty floors. Chapel candles that burn without wind. The next sections of this countdown will return to these themes with deeper dives into university archives, eyewitness interviews, and the investigators who keep coming back. For now, the question remains, why do these walls keep students in their rows? A hush settles over the list like a final bell. Outside, a floorboard creaks that should not be creaking. Somewhere on a campus not far from you, a light flickers twice and then holds, as if someone unseen has taken attendance one more time. A hush settles over the list like a final bell. Outside, a floorboard creaks that should not be creaking. Somewhere on a campus not far from you, a light flickers twice and then holds, as if someone unseen has taken attendance one more time. Archivists, former staff, and the occasional tenacious alum are the people who keep these stories from dissolving into rumor entirely. They are the ones who pry open brittle boxes, who read faded ledger entries aloud in empty rooms, who compare names and dates until patterns appear. Their work does not prove ghosts. It only shows that places accumulate histories of care, of neglect, of routine, and that those histories are not neutral. They leave impressions. They leave expectations. At Pennhurst, for instance, a retired records clerk pulled a thin file from a sealed box and read aloud the dates of admissions and departures for a ward where the tunnels below are said to march with phantom feet. The ledger is brittle but clear. Names, ages, dates of transfer. Several entries stop without a clarifying note. Local historians caution that administrative turbulence and poor record-keeping explain some of the gaps. Yet when a former night orderly speaks, his memory fills the ledger with texture that numbers cannot convey. A small shoe left at a sink. A lullaby hummed as staff made rounds, the way the corridor would seem to breathe on winter nights. He says carefully that the tunnels kept memory in a way the registry did not, and that sometimes the living mistake memory for presence. Investigators who have spent dozens of nights in Pennhurst's undercrofts remember different things. A recorder that will pick up what sounds like a child's laughter only when no one below can explain it. Batteries that drain inexplicably, and temperature gradients that stubbornly reappear in the same small alcove. One team leader, weary and pragmatic, described an EVP captured near a rusted hatch. Played at the right speed and filtered, it yields a breathy fragment, no clear word, but the cadence of a voice trying to name someone. He will not claim the voice is a child's. He will say only that the pattern repeats in different places, in different nights, and that the repetition itself is what keeps him returning. Repetition is the curriculum of hauntings, the same syllable rehearsed until it feels necessary. At Waverly Hills, the schoolroom anecdote about Mary and the bouncing ball takes on a different shape when told by a former volunteer who used to read to children in those makeshift classrooms. She remembers the room as a place of defiant brightness, patched curtains and crayons lined up like tiny flags. After long silence, she adds the human aftertaste. The room of small things held grief in miniature, pull toys, a sweater left on a chair, names whispered into hands. You could feel their insistence, she says. They wanted you to know they were still there, doing what children do. She is willing to relate the night she felt a brush on her shoulder. She felt it as a child's curiosity, not malice. Her recorder, when played back, contains the softest syllable that listeners have transcribed as play. Not a command, but an invitation. The team who filmed a documentary there set up a sequence of wide-angle shots of the schoolroom over one night. Time-lapse footage shows a small, slow wobble of light across the floor, like something passing just beneath the threshold of visibility. The filmmakers argued at length about whether a distant car or a flicker in the grid could explain it. They never produced a single satisfying natural explanation for why the pattern echoed repeated stories. Movement near the window, a child's presence in the periphery, toys displaced at dawn. Their final cut included the image without commentary, letting viewers decide if the wobble was a trick of the camera or something else refusing to leave. The tales from Notre are more theatrical. Washington Hall and the lakeside path lend themselves to cinematic images. A uniform at the water's edge, lace-like footprints, a sweatshirt left damp on a bench. The custodian who found the soaked sweatshirt is a practical man whose career has been one of gossip and late shifts. He will tell you the bench was dry when he rounded it, and that no one could explain the wetness on the fabric or its sudden warmth as he picked it up. The feeling he describes is not only cold but like being passed by, an impression of someone moving through without regard to the living. The investigative footage from the chapel, faint aberrations at the pulpit only visible in playback, asks more questions than it answers. Those aberrations, when slowed, show a suggestion of verticality, as though clothing hung in the wrong wind. The audio team found a breathy utterance by the lake that some hear as a name, others as the fragment of a chant. The ambiguity is exactly what the campus stories feed on, the space between recognition and not quite recognition. On the more staid grounds of Hampton-Sydney, the Rector apparition is both a literal memento and a lingering cultural pressure. Former faculty recall a perfection of ritual that could become crushing. One emeritus professor, whose voice is patient and threaded with irony, recalls a winter morning when he found his gown at the faculty lounge slung as if someone had just stepped away. He did not feel threatened, he felt admonished. The EVP from that evening is short, a clipped phrase that listeners have heard as, "Take your seat." Whether these are echoes of long-remembered discipline or the residue of someone who cannot let go, they function like institutional punctuation, a reminder of the order that once governed bodies in those halls. Saurin Hall's chapel collects stories that are quieter but no less intense. A visiting researcher's collar tugged, a kneeler that sank, a choir tone emerging in an empty sanctuary. One project aimed at comparing photographic artifacts with architectural features pledged to find natural explanations, and did in several cases. Old wiring that creates smears on long-exposure film, an air vent that causes a kneeler to dip. Still, some images resist tidy resolution, blurred face-like lights in the exact place a witness later reports seeing a bowed figure. And the way survivors of the institution speak about the chapel is telling. To them, the scent of incense is not merely a smell but a mnemonic hook that returns them to a time they cannot unremember. That is the haunting of ritual. It calls people back to the feel of something they once learned by rote. Dormitory stories, Stevens College and the circular military dorm, are about intimacy. A bedroom is a crucible for privacy and rumor. It becomes suspicious to wake to a hairpin on a pillow or to hear disciplined footsteps that circle the central common. An alum who returned to the circular dorm for a documentary visit said the sound of the march is the closest thing to cruelty in the building's memory. Perfectly measured steps that suggest control even after control is no longer exercised. For those who survived strict institutions, such sounds are not merely eerie, they are accusatory, a kind of afterlife for discipline. Contact mics and motion sensors tell different technical tales, sometimes registering impulses with no visible cause, sometimes remaining entirely mute. The scientists who work alongside the ghost hunters stress that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that these systems are imperfect witnesses in their own right. The abandoned labs and the technical school with the lingering smell are another breed of haunting, chemical in texture, mechanistic in its manifestations. Alums who remember late nights soldering and waiting for circuits to complete describe a kind of professional memory that lingers like ozone. A professor emeritus insists that what people describe as a smell is really procedural memory, muscle memory of repeating tasks, and that in a building dense with such repetitions, it is easy to feel the past as palpable. Yet there is video of a beaker rolling across a bench with no apparent cause, and that footage pushed the students who shot it into months of debate. They replayed frames, experimented with drafts, and tested the surface tension of the wood. None of their experiments quite replicated the slow, steady motion their camera recorded. The mystery remained, an apparently deliberate less movement. The campus infirmary, with its echo of treatment and what the transcripts called a pulse that is not yours, produces one of the most tactile hauntings. A resident assistant described waking to a pressure on her chest and believing, for a suspended instant, that she was not alone. The audio picked up a throb, a low repeating sound, not quite a heartbeat, but suggestive enough to fetch chills from listeners. Physicians who have been asked to weigh in suggest that the mind can produce phantom sensations during sleep, that pressure on the chest is a known sleep-related phenomenon. But the correlation of the sensation with audio elements and with the building's hospital geometry causes many to read the effect as a memory too stubborn to die. The cadence of vital signs and the rhythm of being tended repeated in the dark. Libraries and auditoriums, places of study and performance, preserve different tonalities of hauntings. In the stacks, whispering that later reveals itself on parabolic microphones as rustle. In the Memorial Auditorium, stage lights that bloom for a single minute at 2:02 a.m., as though the house still expects its audience. One archivist catalogs a ledger of last performances and a municipal report that hints at an accident decades ago, an event that may or may not explain the late-night atmosphere of the stage. A theater tech who once stayed overnight to restore rigging describes waking to the sensation of someone kneeling by the stage and seeing a pool of light shape itself into a winged smear. He left without finishing his shift. The photo he took of the winged streak sits, framed in his living room, an artifact that resists explanation, and one he does not show to his grandchildren. The chapel steps calling names described a peculiar horror. A name called from stone. Names are private. They belong to bodies and histories. People who hear their name whispered from an empty stair, who turn and find only leaves and a child's print, describe a particular invasive intimacy. One student, frozen in place after hearing his name called late at night, later found a damp, small shoe print on the stone. He insisted then, later to interviewers, that the sound had an almost parental cadence, the kind of voice that reaches and commands. The sonic team placed contact mics and hid recorders in the shrubbery. The captured audio offers whispers, fragments, vowel-heavy syllables that suggest names but stop short of legibility. That very near miss is what unnerves listeners most. At the Coastal College Observatory, the chalk that rewrites itself and diagrams that appear without hands point toward the idea that knowledge itself can be haunted. A former astronomy student who became a teaching assistant kept a notebook of oddities, chalk arcs that seemed to glow faintly when viewed through a camera, instrument readouts that flickered in unison with EVPs. He is careful when he speaks, aware that to say haunted is to invite ridicule. He prefers residual notation, a way of thinking about how repeated practice, writing, counting, measuring, could leave an imprint. The implication is less supernatural and more psychological, but the image is chilling. Lines of chalk that insist, "I did not leave." Some investigators come at these places with skepticism honed into method. They chase anomalies, they test for drafts, they check for electrical interference, and they spend hours in cold rooms listening for anything that might be called a sound. They are the ones who will say, with some relief, that a motion sensor tripped because of a mouse, or that a smear on a negative can be explained by shutter speed. But many of them also will tell you about the nights when nothing in their methodology accounts for a captured event. A voice on a recorder speaking with the cadence of a child who is not there, a camera that loses power for no apparent reason, a thermal imager showing a discrete, transient cold spot that aligns with eyewitness testimony. Their reports are cautious in language but emphatic in their effect. Something is causing us to look closer. In conversations with survivors, teachers who worked late shifts, janitors who spent their lives walking empty halls, alumni who returned to be caretakers, another pattern emerges. These people speak not of malevolence, but of persistence. They mention small kindnesses that seem to repeat, a light set on a timer, a chair slightly angled as if to invite someone to sit, a coat placed on a bench as though waiting for its owner. Others report harsher contact, a scratch on an arm reported by a researcher, a burn on a palm allegedly fitting the curve of a radiator that was cold to the touch. Each such report is filtered by caution. Phrases like reported, claimed, and account recur. And yet the aggregate of them constructs a posture that these places replay what was lived there with a fidelity that sometimes wounds. Legal records and local newspapers supply context but stop short of supernatural verdicts. They reveal overcrowding, underfunding, accidents, structural failures, and the human stories of those who worked on these campuses. A municipal audit might show deferred maintenance on dormitory wiring or a staffing shortage at a sanatorium during a harsh winter. Those details help explain, in pragmatic ways, why a place might be less safe or more prone to tragedy. They do not explain, however, why a ball rolls across an empty floor at dawn, or why a bell tolls at an odd hour above a sleeping quad. The gap between administrative fact and experiential testimony is where the legends concentrate. There are also cultural mechanisms that make hauntings persuasive. Students pass stories in dorm lounges, embellishing and refining them. Senior pranks become part of the lore. Ghost tours harvest the most disturbing tidbits and market them as an attraction. A campus with an official ghost tour can both normalize and monetize the fear. Guides who lead those tours play their role as curators of the eerie. They know which names to whisper, which corners to linger on, and how to time a tale so that the bell across the green seems to puncture the exact moment. Yet even guides who roll their eyes in daylight sometimes admit to the hair-raising moments at night when the tour returns an hour late because a participant swears they saw a figure at the bell tower. It is on that thin line between commerce and reverence that the stories thrive. It is also true that many nights of investigation produce nothing. Many cameras catch only empty hallways. Many recorders capture the comforting noise of HVAC systems and rodents. There are plenty of rational explanations on the record. The presence of a story, however, itself a social artifact, alters how people move through spaces. A student who knows a ghost story will walk differently under a tower. They will not loiter by a lake at midnight. That behavioral change becomes part of the legend, which then becomes evidence in the phenomenological sense. People act as though a presence were there, and their behavior confirms the story to those who see them acting. Respect for the dead and for survivors of institutional failures is paramount in these conversations. When people mention abuse, neglect, or deaths that occurred on campus, the script must tread carefully. In many cases, records are incomplete. In others, accounts conflict. Reporters and investigators use phrasing that qualifies and hedges. Reports indicate, accounts suggest, local lore holds, because certainty often lies beyond reach. That caution is not a refusal to tell hard stories, but a recognition of the human cost embedded within them. Toward the end of their project, one investigative team did something uncommon. They sat in the center of a campus quad and read aloud the names from a list of former students and staff compiled from archived yearbooks and payroll ledgers. It was not a seance. It was an act of remembrance. Some on the team had expected nothing more than an exercise in empathy. Instead, as they read, a wind rose, not brisk, but present, and disturbed a neat page of lawn in patterns that looked like footsteps aligning with the cadence of their reading. An audio recorder picked up a whisper under the wind that the transcribers later wrote as a fragment. Stay. The team recorded the event carefully and debated it for months. The word appears on the tape in a way that confounds some analysts and comforts others. The question it raises is rarely scientific. What responsibility does the living world have to the echoes of the past? As the nights of investigation stretch into years for some of these places, a new generation of folklore scholars has begun to treat campus hauntings as cultural artifacts worthy of study in their own right. They ask what these stories do for a community, how they act as cautionary tales, as sites of communal grief, as ways for people to process institutional failure without the machinery of litigation. In such readings, a haunted library holds more than books. It holds the community's anxieties about knowledge and memory. A haunted dorm mirrors accusations of control and lost youth. A playground that laughs by itself is not only eerie, it is a locus of collective sorrow for children who never return to their homes. For viewers watching from home, whether you are a skeptic or someone who keeps an old tape recorder in a drawer just in case, the sensible thing is to treat these places with respect. There is also a practical legal imperative: do not trespass. Many of the buildings discussed here are private property, some are structurally unsound, and some have caretakers who deserve to make the rules for access. If you wish to experience a haunted place, seek an official tour or public event. The truth is that legends carry weight enough without needing to tempt fate. As the series reaches its close, the patterns remain. Institutional settings, especially those tied to care, learning, or discipline, are rich soil for stories that outlast their living participants. Whether one interprets these stories as genuine hauntings, as psychological residue, or as cultural performance, the human reaction is consistent. People feel watched, and those feelings change how spaces are lived in. Sometimes the change is subtle. A freshman avoids the library's backstacks at night. Sometimes it is dramatic. A building closes and remains frozen in disuse. A bell tower falls silent. A playground is fenced and locked. And yet, there are counterintuitive moments of grace. A former nurse who worked late shifts in a converted infirmary told of leaving a cup of tea on a sill and returning to find it placed on a tray at the foot of an empty bed, as if set out for someone she once cared for. She cried then, quietly, and she did not consider it frightening. For her, the act felt like an acknowledgement. Another caretaker, a woman who has spent 2 decades sweeping the same high-ceilinged corridor, talks about a lamp that returns to being lit after storms without anyone having replaced the bulb. She calls it the building's stubbornness to remain hospitable. These are the tender hauntings, the ones that ask for a hand rather than a scream. The final image, then, should be neither sensational nor sanitized. It should keep the mood of the places we've visited, solemn, uncanny, insistently human. Picture a classroom at dusk. The desks are arranged in their habitual order, pigment of years caught in the wood grain. Someone left one small paper on a desk. A scrap of a worksheet, a child's crude drawing of a sun, a name across the top in shaky letters. The lights are off. The corridor beyond the window goes black. A slow draft threads the room, lifting the paper's corner, as if a small attentive hand has just turned it. It is the kind of motion that does not demand explanation, and that, in its quiet persistence, asks you to remember. If one thing ties these 15 places together, it is this. Walls remember what we teach and what we neglect. They hold the sound of lessons and the weight of lost afternoons. Whether the sounds we hear at night are ghosts, echoes, or human memory made audible, they shape how we inhabit institutions now. They are reminders that the past is seldom as distant as we imagine. They are reminders, perhaps, that attendance takes many forms. Share this with someone who loves ghost stories and subscribe for more deep dives into haunted places. And if you ever find yourself alone in an old lecture hall or outside a bell tower when the light tilts wrong, take a breath and listen. You might hear a page turn. You might hear a breath. You might hear someone, soft as a roll call, say a name that once belonged to the living and now keeps sitting in the chair beside you.